Well, good morning, Boardman. Great to be here today. Have you guys enjoyed the rain over the past few days? Isn't it just wonderful? I always enjoy a good rain. And then people come in here and they're kind of hot, and then the air conditioners. We rile you all up during worship, and then about halfway through the sermon, we're going to refrigerate you as you leave the building today. So we love this tension that people start to feel in the midst of this. I don't know if you noticed, Rochelle was up here leading a song today, and Rochelle is our children's ministry lead here at Boardman. But don't worry, we opened some windows, we threw down some Skittles. It's going to be a great day for your kids back there, so they will be just fine. No, we have so many exceptional volunteers that make sure that our ministries really go off without a hitch, so that some of our ministry people can operate in some different gift sets that they have, which is always good for them as well, just to be able to do many of those things. So we're in this sermon series called "Excuse Me What," where Jesus makes some of these provocative statements and kind of says things to the audience that's listening to him at the time that sort of makes them perk up and wonder, okay, what does Jesus really mean by these things? Because some of these statements kind of catch us off guard a little bit. And today's statement that we're going to focus on is about family. Jesus actually talks about family, but not in the way that you think. You see, everybody in this room came from a family of origin, right? You had a mom and a dad, and whether you know your mom or dad or don't know your mom or dad, whether you have a good relationship with them or not, if they're both still living or maybe they've both passed on already or some combination of that, every one of us came from a family unit. And that was God's design, right? He wanted us to come from other people. It wasn't like God just continually created people. He created a system that was self-sustaining. Now, there's actually an order to this system as well. God also gave us marriage, right? Where a husband and a wife come together in covenant, and that's what the Bible talks about. And then children come from that covenant, right? The covenant of marriage is first, and then the covenant of children is next. And then that's the way that it's supposed to be. Now, in our world today, sometimes that's not exactly how things happen, right? Because not everybody decides that they want to have kids. If I ask most couples want to have children or think it's a good idea before they actually have kids. They think it's a good idea, right? You know what I mean? And then they have kids and they realize they've made a horrible mistake with their lives. We've all had that moment at some point or another. But the reality is that sometimes that's not always the way that happens. Not everybody decides to have kids. Not everybody chooses a covenant of marriage. Not everybody needs that in their life. Some people choose to get married and are not able to have children. Or other people, they have kids and then they decide to get married after that. And I'm not saying this is not a place of judgment wherever you came from or wherever you are. But this is one of the greatest challenges that we face when it comes to step families that sort of happen later. If somebody goes through the death of a spouse or goes through divorce and then marries somebody else in the midst of that, a lot of times the kids predate the marriage covenant. And it's not that it can't work, and it doesn't mean that just because you got married before you had kids that everything in your life is going to be amazing. It's still difficult. But one of the greatest pieces of advice that I've tried to give step families as they're entering into this new era is saying your spouse has to come before your kids. And that can be very difficult for people whose kids are predating the marriage that they're about to step into. But it's God's way. God had decided that he wants us to be in covenant with him first, and then with a mate, and then with kids. And we're the ones that kind of go outside of that, or life doesn't always turn that way in order for us to do it. We have two girls. And I remember it was probably a Saturday morning, I think it was, many years ago. We had two girls. They were a lot younger back then. And Haley and I were drinking coffee, sitting in the living room. And she looked at me somewhere during our conversation, and I don't remember the exact words, but she said to me, "Do you realize how much more money we would have if we did not have kids?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Do you realize how much more time we would have? Do you realize how fewer miles our cars would have if we did not have kids?" And so I've thought about that a lot for many years, and I've come up with, okay, what do I think the benefits of having kids actually is? And I came up with three things. The first one is this. The number one benefit of having kids is that they are incredible tax shelters for you when you file your taxes on April 15th, okay? That's really the first thing. The second thing is, as they get older, your chores start to diminish because they can unpack the dishwasher and help with other things. And the third and greatest reason why to have kids is the hope that one day they will leave, okay? And that's my list. That's why we had children, right? No, that's not why we have kids. We love our kids. We want to have kids. In fact, God tells the married couple early in the Bible, go out, be fruitful, multiply, have children, have legacy, have this desire for family. And that is ultimately what we try to do. I've often said this to people, if you are the biggest thing in your story, it's probably a pretty sad story. Okay, it is. We have this desire to pass things on. It doesn't just mean that kids is the only way to do that. There are many ways to influence the lives of other people. But we have that innate desire in us to do something that is powerful and meaningful and that is bigger than any one of us. But I do want to tell you this, that all children are born as pagans. And I'm going to tell you why. I don't mean that as a joke. I mean that seriously. Because they are selfish beings. They are. They do not know the 10 Commandments when they come out. They're all about themselves. We all are. And hopefully, over the time that we have our kids at home, for whether it be 18 years or 20 years or they're 37 and about to leave or whatever it is in your home, we hope that in that time we will teach them these building blocks of what it means to be successful adults. If you are talking to Jesus, he will say, when we have the basics of the 10 Commandments in our lives, we are going to be healthier adults, right? Because what are the 10 Commandments about? The first 3 are about God. Have no other gods before me, no idols, don't use my name in vain. Those are good ideas. Prioritize God in your life. Then there's a thing about Sabbath and learning to find balance. And then there's this 6 ways that we interact with people, right? Mostly the do's and don'ts of how we live. And hopefully when you launch your kids out into the world, which is something that we want for them, that they will become successful adults who understand how to prioritize God first and how to treat people in the world. That's your job as parents, to instill that into your kids. The Bible says our job as parents is to aim our kids in the right direction, and hopefully when they get older, they will live towards the things that we've taught them. This is what we're supposed to do. In fact, your main mission as parents, people often say, well, I don't know how to be an evangelist, or I don't know how to bring people to Christ. Your home and your kids is your battleground, right? If you lead your kids to love Jesus and to prioritize him and to treat people well, then you have done your job as a parent. That's what you're supposed to do. And sometimes I think we unfortunately forget that. I would also encourage you, like I said, there's got to be bigger things in our story than just us. How many of you have been on a mission trip before? Any kind of mission trip? Local, domestic, foreign, okay? Some of you have. It's always amazing to me because when we start mission trips, we think we're going to go somewhere and we're going to do something good, which we often do. We have this desire to do something good for somebody else, right? The story is bigger than us. We want to give back. We want to shape and form people, and that's what we should do. I got to do a ton of mission trips as a kid in Africa. We would go on a lot of things, go on mission trips. My parents supported a lot of different works, and we went all the way up into Africa. I actually came on a mission trip to the U.S., to Pennsylvania. We went to a very impoverished portion of Pennsylvania. We did some mission. I got to go to Honduras in Central America. My wife got to go and do a medical mission in Guatemala. It's wonderful to be able to go and experience the world that's bigger than yours. But there's something powerful that happens in the midst of that. You realize along the way that it's not about you. And sometimes we have this very selfish reason, I'm going to go and save this portion of the world or go and do something powerful. And that's not what mission trips are about. Mission trips are about learning to see the world in a way that we don't live into, so that we can come home and see our world more with those eyes. That's why I would encourage you guys to be a part of something like that. And once you've raised your kids and raised your family and poured this story of God into them, we should look towards greater missions. Your kids are going to learn a lot about what you really believe by the way that you treat people, by the way that you treat each other. I tell people all the time, if you want your kids to learn about healthy marriage, they're going to watch you. How do you guys talk to each other? How do you guys fight? How do you guys deal with conflict? How do you deal with the person at the checkout? How do you deal with somebody when your food is wrong at the restaurant and you're sending it back? They are watching you all the time, and they want to make sure that you have that priority in your life. But sometimes you get to step outside of that and go and do something that's a little bit bigger, and step out of the family mission field into maybe a foreign or a different kind of mission field. There was a few families that got together in the late 1950s. Then the two main guys, it was Jim and Nate. And they really had raised their kids, raised their family. They really wanted people to love Jesus. And so in the late 50s, they found this tribe in Ecuador. They were a very nomadic tribe, a very violent tribe. They were a tribe that was constantly about dominance, and there was always fighting with them. And they had started to build some relationships with these people in Ecuador, on this mission field. And they really wanted to go and share the gospel and share the love and the hope of Jesus so that these people didn't have to live the way that they did. And so they had a little plane, and they were able to fly down and go there. And it was this really nomadic tribe in the middle of nowhere that was very inaccessible. And they made their way down there. They had flown down at some point, and when they landed, the man who was the son of the chief named Menkani, he was kind of the general of the armies. They saw this coming, and they were fearful that these white men were going to enslave them or do horrible things to them. And so he gave the order to kill these missionaries. And at the river's edge, after they had landed the plane, the tribal men of this community, they got spears, and they went and they killed these missionaries. They slaughtered them right there on the edge. The interesting thing about it was all of these men were actually carrying guns. And when they found out later that not one of them had decided to draw their guns or to use that as a way to reach these people, recognizing that they would destroy all hope of ever reaching them, and so they willingly laid down their lives to save these people and to give them opportunity in the future. Now we're going to come back to that story in just a minute, because that's a really sad kind of beginning to the story, and it gets really heavy very quickly. But Jesus talks about the price and the cost of making God a priority in our lives. And he does it in a very weird way, because he talks about family, and it sounds very aggressive when he starts, but it really isn't designed to be. If you look at Luke chapter 14, I'm sorry, that's kind of hard to see, I know. But in Luke chapter 14, it says large crowds were traveling with Jesus. We see this as kind of a norm for what he's doing. Large crowds are traveling with Jesus, and he turns to them and he says, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, such a person cannot be my disciple." Now, this sounds very aggressive when we think about it, and what Jesus is doing is he's kind of showing the order that God has placed, right? It starts with our father and mother, and then we move to our own families of wife and children, brothers and sisters, and then he ends with us, right? Even you. If you don't hate your own life, which sounds really bad, right? Now, first of all, Jesus is not saying that you have to hate everybody in your circle. Let's just be clear about that. What he is saying is that our priority should be so strong towards God that it appears that we have almost disregard for our family. It doesn't mean we push them aside, but that we live so fully into the priority of God in our life, and from that perspective, that it appears that we are willing to do anything and give up anything to be Jesus' followers. Now, in Matthew, it says it a little nicer, and it uses love language instead of hate language, which I think is probably a little better. And you can hear what Jesus is saying, right? Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me. You see it? He's not saying you can't love your father and mother, right? You can't, not that you can't say that they're important, but he's saying if you love them more than me, then you're not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. You can hear the language of priority. Whoever does not take up their cross or does not surrender something or sacrifice something, they're not worthy of me. In other words, if you want low-cost discipleship, there is no such thing, is what he's saying. then you're just a fan of Jesus or a friend of Jesus, but you're not truly a follower of Jesus. And then whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. What he's saying is, if you prioritize your life, you're going to ultimately lose. If you prioritize God, you're going to find something that is far more powerful. And this is what Jesus is really talking about. Discipleship is about priority. It's about saying, what comes first in my life? And like I said, we are all born into this system, and our world is very good at telling us that we are the most important thing in our life. That it's all about you. And everything that you want and what makes you happy is ultimately what you should pursue. And Jesus kind of says, that's not really true. Because if God is in his first place in your life, and everything else is subservient to that, that's the way that God has ordered the covenants. And maybe the theme of what Jesus is saying is this: don't give up what is eternal for what is temporary. Like, as parents, don't give your whole life to your kids, because your kids are designed to leave. And either they're going to leave and you're going to be heartbroken and not know who you are, or you're going to leave with them. And you're not going to prioritize things in their correct order. And we should never give what is eternal away for what is temporary. This is what Jesus is talking about. Now, there's this story in Scripture, which I'm glad has been told, although it's kind of an interesting story. Jesus is 12 years old. And right before this, he has read the Scripture in the temple. And he has proclaimed himself as a man, as an adult of faith. Doesn't mean he's physically a man. Even in the culture, there's still some time. But this is the moment that he says, my faith is mine. It's not my parents' faith anymore. I am making a decision about my faith. And this is very common in the Jewish practice, what we call the bar mitzvah or the bat mitzvah, depending on if you're a man or if you're a woman. It says when he was 12 years old, he went up to the festival according to the custom. So now that he has proclaimed his own faith, he is eligible to go with his family to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, right? They don't leave the kids behind anymore. Before this, he was not allowed to go because he wasn't a self-proclaimed person in faith. Are you with me? Now he's made his own decision, so now he's allowed to go with his family, because this is not only his parents' story, this is his story now as well. So he goes up there, and it says, after the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Now, I know immediately we can think that Joseph and Mary are careless parents. They're not, okay? They would travel with huge groups of people, with tons of family. It's not that it's not like 5 of them got in the station wagon and they just didn't realize Jesus wasn't there, okay? He's traveling with friends and family. They've been hanging out for several weeks together. In fact, Mary and Joseph are just glad to have a break, right? Am I with me, parents? Right? I don't even care where he is right now. We just want to talk to each other for a second. Okay. So thinking that he was in their company, of course, they traveled for a whole day. I love how the story slowly escalates, right? Mary and Joseph were just having the best day. They were reconnecting. They were talking. And then Mary looked at Joseph and said, "Hey, have you seen Jesus?" And Joseph said, I thought you marriage fight just happening right here. I love it. It says, then they began looking for him, right? Among their relatives and friends, because that's where they expected he's going to be. When they did not find him, they had to turn back to Jerusalem to look for him. Watch how the Bible explains this. It says, after 3 days. There's an echo here about what's going to happen at the end of the story. Don't you just love how that's kind of dropped in the middle of that, how Luke does that? Hey, they didn't see him. They didn't know he was there. And after 3 days, they were coming up with a game plan for how they were going to find Jesus. But after 3 days, they find him where? In the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Where is Jesus? Jesus is showing the priority of his life now, that his priority is God. Where else would they find him? Because his faith is his own. And everybody who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. And when he saw his parents, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, and I love how sanitized this probably was, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." I don't think that's what she said, but we get the gist. Okay? Well, why are you searching for me? Didn't you know I'd be here in my father's house? Like, I sort of think that's what, a teenager would say. At least that's been my experience. There is no verse 50, because verse 50 says, and then from around the corner you heard a loud slap, and then Mary emerged rubbing her hand, right? That's what I think happened. But listen to what Jesus is saying. He's not being catty, he's not being sarcastic. He's saying, where else would I be? Because God is my priority. I'm not out living it up. I'm not out having time on the town or making new friends. Of course I'm going to be in the temple. Why? Because that is the priority of my life. That's what I'm going to do. That's what you, Mary and Joseph, have trained me to prioritize. And so of course that's where I'm going to be. I'm going to be talking about God. I'm going to be sharing this story. I'm going to be treating people well. You see, she comes to him and goes, why did you treat us badly, right? Why did you not honor your father and mother? And Jesus very nicely, he says, because you're not my priority, God is. And by the way, you taught me that. That's why I'm being successful at this. It's actually an incredibly powerful and beautiful moment. The Bible actually tells us that Mary starts to treasure these things because she feels the success as a parent. As Jesus goes on in his ministry, we see him do a lot of things. Do you guys remember the story when they're lowering somebody through the roof? They take off the roof tiles, and they lower him down, the paralyzed man, and Jesus heals him. You remember that story, right? Nobody can get into the house, but Jesus' mother and brothers, they start to realize that Jesus is going to get in trouble politically because of what he's doing, that the system that they're a part of is not going to accept what he's doing. And so, out of concern, they tried to come to Jesus and say, hey, we want to help you not get in trouble. And so it says, Jesus' mother and brothers arrived, and they stand outside because they can't get in. They send somebody to call him, and a crowd was sitting around him, and they told him, oh, your mother and your brothers are outside, and they're looking for you. And Jesus asks this question, well, who actually are my mother and my brothers? And then he looked at those seated around him, and he said, here is my mother and my brothers and my sisters. Because whoever does God's will, whoever does the Father's will, they are my brother and sister and mother. Jesus continually answers this question and says, the priority of our lives have to be right, even not at the cost of our family, but that's what we should try to do when we raise our kids well, right? If your kids leave home and God is their priority and they know how to treat people and they understand that the covenant of marriage comes before the covenant of kids, it doesn't mean that their life is going to be super easy and they're never going to face anything difficult, but it means that they're going to see things through that lens. I don't know if you guys do this, and I don't want to give any plugs, but there's some financial shows that you can listen to, and you can often see them on YouTube about, hey, let's eliminate debt, and let's try to save, and let's put money in the right places. I would guarantee you that if I asked any of you, do you guys want your kids to be financially successful when they leave home? I don't think anybody would say, no, we want them to live with huge amounts of debt and live beyond their means and not be successful. Of course we want our kids and our families to be successful. And yet there is a lie that our world tells us constantly that draws us away from that. The Bible's very clear about a lot of things. And every time you talk about these things, people get a little itchy, as I say. The Bible talks about tithing a whole lot. And tithing actually has nothing to do with money. It has everything to do with priority. It's the same as when God creates Adam and Eve and puts them in the garden, and he says, you can have everything. I only ask you one thing. Don't touch this tree. And what do? They take God out of the priority, and they put themselves there, and they touch the tree, and it has devastating consequences. And the same is true for our time. It's always amazing to me, and I'm not calling anybody out in particular. But we live in a world where there are no more sacred days, right? Sunday mornings are no longer sacred when it comes to sports, or Wednesday nights. And I hear people all the time saying, we just need to get back to this time when there's sacred time. And I want to tell you some bad news. It'll never happen. The sports will win. Because that's what the world is amazing at. And it's so funny because we will give our lives away to these things. I have an older daughter that's in ballet. It's 5 days a week. I make 10 trips to and from my house to downtown Youngstown every week. And it takes a lot of my time. And it's a priority for us. Now, we try to keep all things in their right priority. I'm not saying it's bad for your kids to play sports or to be in activities or whatever it is. But it's amazing to me when I watch parents who will give their whole lives away so that their kids can have some sporting event or some equipment or something else. And then when you say to them, hey, could you serve? Could you take an hour serving with our kids? I don't have time. But I watched you at the soccer game from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m., and you were there all day supporting that. You're giving up what is eternal for something that is temporary. And I'm not saying that sports are the enemy. I'm not saying that activities are the enemy. I don't know how much is too much. You have to decide that. But I think that if our goal is to say God is going to be our priority, and the way that we treat people is going to be very important second to that, but these are the things that have to be in place and have to be in line. I've had people before there was a gentleman who was part of a leadership at a previous church that I served at. He had 2 girls, just like we did. And his girls came to church most of the time or some of the time, but they never wanted to go to the youth events, and they didn't want to sit in church. They just wanted to sit in the nursery with the babies. That's what they like to do. And I remember he and I had a conversation about this, that I said, hey, it's going to matter that your kids are being formed and shaped spiritually. And he said, well, that's just what they like to do, and we're okay with that. When his oldest daughter left home, she was 19 years old, he called me one day, and he said, I need your help. She moved out of the house. She moved in with her boyfriend. They don't go to church. They have no faith. He said, what can I do to teach her that this matters? And I very sadly looked at him, and I said, nothing. Because they've already learned it. I remember there was a family that after we did a series on giving and people kind of learned the idea behind it and what it is truly about. Their kids, they came and they said, we don't give to the church because we're so strapped with everything and all the activities that our kids are doing, but we want to get the priority right in our life. And so we had a tough conversation with our kids. We sat them all down and we said, we are reordering the priority of our life. And we are going to give to God first, and then we're going to do everything else, which means instead of doing 2 and 3 sports, all of you guys, you're only going to get to do 1. But the reason why we're doing that is not because we don't love you, it's because God is our priority first. And I think that those kids might have been mad for a second, but they are teaching valuable lessons to their kids because they refuse to give up what is eternal for what is temporary. And I know some of your kids might go to college, and they might play sports, and they might do great. But I'm telling you what, sports will not lead them to a happier, healthier life with God. They're not going to learn it there. We have to, as parents, help train and design. I have so many parents that come up to me and goes, we never went to church when our kids were small, and now none of our kids go to church, and it's so hard to try to get them to be a part of this because it matters. And Jesus tells us it matters. We have to prioritize God first in our lives. You want a healthier marriage? Prioritize God first. Give to God first. Be sacrificial there first. Then do it with your spouse, and then do it with your kids. This is what God shares with us and tells us. And when we learn that, it changes things. You know, Nate and Jim, who went down to Ecuador and lost their lives for their faith, their 2 boys, years later, traveled to the same place. And they finally were able to establish contact with these people. And Menkani at that time, who's the guy pictured in the middle here, he was now the chief of the whole tribe. And if you've ever seen, they made a movie about this called End of the Spear. And it's an older movie now, but you can still find it in different places. But it basically tells the story and all kind of ends at this moment where Menkani finally takes these 2 boys to the site, to the place where their fathers had been slaughtered. And Menkani hands Steve the very same spear that he killed his dad with. And he demands him to take his life. And Steve, in that moment, he says something very profound. He looks at him and says, you did not take my dad's life, but he gave it as a gift to you and your people. And by the way, there's another story about a man that nobody took his life, but he gave it for his people. This entire tribe became Jesus followers. And I would imagine that Steve's dad, Nate, would have been okay with that. He was willing to pay the price because God was his ultimate priority. And maybe there's a word in that for parents, for spouses, for others as well. Is that one of the greatest ways that we live into covenant with each other and with our kids is by putting God first. And it's a big ask. And that's why so many people get upset about this, is because Jesus really says, you got to love me first and foremost. And everything else should be secondary. And when we get that wrong, it doesn't work. And so maybe there's a point of conviction. I'm not here to tell you, listen, we are not perfect parents. We have good days. We have bad days. I make a lot of jokes about my kids, but I love my kids. But yeah, we still yell at them some days, and they still leave their shoes everywhere, right? And our home is the same as yours. But we try really hard to teach them that God is first. Because one day when they leave, we're not going to leave with them. And we want them to find this on their own. And they're never going to find it unless we teach it to them. And so in the midst of this, maybe there's some conviction for all of us to say, what is God calling me to? What is most important? And is everything in my life pointing towards God being my priority, or is it not? There's still time to change it. There's still time to do better. And hopefully you hear that as a word of hope today and a word of power today. So let me pray for us, and then we're going to sing one more song. But Father, we just thank you for meeting us in this place. Thank you that we can have a few laughs together and just that we can just be honest about where we are. And God, I pray that today that we would not feel just an overwhelming sense of guilt, but that God, that we would feel inspired and convicted to reorder some things in our lives, all of us. God, maybe if we could just learn today to start with you and not with us, God, then we would really learn the greatest lessons. Father, if we're parents, if we're married couples, would we realize that the goal is not to give our lives away to our kids, but to give our lives away to you first, and then to our spouse second, and to our kids third. And God, we just pray that we would find truth in the story today. And God, maybe we're even in a journey of our lives, just individually, where we haven't really given you what you deserve. And we just pray that today that we would have the courage to take a step towards you in priority. We thank you for Jesus. We thank you for the opportunity we have to share and be a part of this family. And we ask this all in his name. And the church together says, amen.